Greetings and welcome to the On Becoming a Healer podcast. I'm Stefan Kertes, and this is my co-host, Saul Weiner. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
One concern we hear and one that I share is about the conditions of our profession in medicine, both from within and from outside, that doctors are unhappy in their work, that they're burnt out, that they're frustrated. One common response to this is to propose either that we change the conditions of work or that we pay doctors more, and I'm interested in both those things, but my friend and colleague Saul has crafted something of a different response, and it's one you're going to find in his book On Becoming a Healer, which was published in 2020. Saul's concept involves asking ourselves and our trainees some very serious questions that are designed to help us pull the curtain away on who we are and who we wish to be in medicine, and in that way, derive a more meaningful life as doctors and as clinicians. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, Saul, where are these questions and how did you come up with the idea that questions would be a useful exercise?
So you've heard me talk on other episodes about my godfather, a family physician named Simon Auster. When I was in medical school and then as a resident and well beyond that, Simon often used to ask me tough questions. Whenever I would complain or whine about my work in many different ways, he would often just come back with questions. His questions had no agenda. He wasn't trying to push me in one direction or another. But these were questions that often initially I might have resented hearing a little bit because they didn't necessarily reinforce my prevailing view of woe is me. And they would get me to think. So I came to appreciate that those questions were often a little painful in the short term, but quite therapeutic in the long term. And so when I wrote on Becoming a Healer, as you know, each chapter, I think there are about 10 chapters, addresses a different theme about becoming a physician. And at the end, I wrote a list of questions that drew on the themes of the chapter. Some of those questions relate directly to examples given in the chapter, but some of them are just general questions. And as you know, over the last year and a half, I've been teaching a class at my medical school for senior residents, initially in internal medicine, but then in the last year, also pediatric residents, that draws on becoming a healer and on these questions. And I've just found them to be incredibly helpful. They really open up dialogue. When I meet with the residents, they have an opportunity before class to write brief essays. I give them usually a couple of questions to choose between, and it's been great. And so I thought it would be really neat to talk about that today.
And just so that we don't keep anybody in a state of suspense, let me offer an example, just so people know the kinds of questions that appear in your book and that you use in this exercise. This one is relatively non-controversial. This question is, if you couldn't be a physician, what would you most want to do instead? How would it be similar or different from what you have sought in a medical career? Can you draw connections between your second choice and medicine to gain perspective on what you most love to do? Assuming you stay in medicine, how can you be sure you are most likely to find it? It kind of opens the door, you know, it's not a particularly threatening question to ask people. I mean, somebody might say they wanted to be a scientist or a race car driver or a fireman. I don't know. But it then leads into something else. That part where it says, how can you be sure you are most likely to find it, is asking about how you'd find some of the joys you anticipated when you thought about that other career.
You know, it's funny because it's, in a sense, you're right, it's a benign question, but I have to tell you that question came to mind when I thought I might flunk out of medical school. I was a first-year medical student, and as you know, I have a learning disability, and I was really struggling. And I was, on the one hand, trying really hard not to flunk out of medical school, but as I think I've mentioned before, I also found a certain peace in thinking about, well, you know, if I do flunk out, I'm not going to define myself by this little voyage of trying to become a doctor. There are other things I really enjoy doing, and then I started to think about what those might be, and I found that really helped. Not in terms of making me think, oh, I don't want to be a doctor anymore, but in terms of reminding me that there was more to who I am than just this effort to become a physician. And sort of out of that experience, this question emerged.
You know, that's interesting because particularly in medical training, the tunnel seems rather narrow. And I certainly remember that my understanding of what I was, who I was, and what I wanted to become was all coned down to pretty much just one thing. And the world was something I could not contemplate if I did not become that one thing, even though there were many moments where I felt a measure of risk about whether I would succeed or even become something like a doctor. So it's a great question to remind us that we are a person beyond the particular practice we're committed to in the moment. So, you know, there's a lot of these questions. We're going to talk through a few of them. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you've brought this into a training environment?
Yeah, I can imagine these questions being helpful in a variety of setting. In the way I'm using them now, they're sent to senior residents who have a few weeks to reflect on one of two prompts and write a response and then send it to me. And then I'll read it. I'll often just respond using track changes with often more questions or thoughts, send it back to them. And then we typically meet in groups of around 4 residents to discuss each other's responses. And that has been really helpful because it opens dialogue. And the residents get to bounce their responses off of each other. I can serve as a sort of moderator. I typically co-facilitate with a colleague who's a pediatric oncologist, and that might be an ideal format. I will say, however, though, I can imagine a few residents or attendings taking a few of these questions out for a beer and just talking about them together. I think what has to be there is a sense of trust, emotional trust, that people can feel safe being open about what they really believe when they look at these questions. And I can also imagine possibly reflecting on these questions on one's own. There's probably some value in doing that as well, although I think this is to some degree a participant sport. I think it's probably most useful when you have somebody who you can bounce your responses off of.
So keep in mind that I'm going to ask a few more questions later about the process and the procedure of making sure people feel trusting and confident. But I'd like to go ahead and talk about one of these questions that are used in the exercises that you've set up. And it goes as follows. Do you see yourself as someone friends turn to when they're in distress or need guidance? If so, what is it that you offer them that enables you to be such a valuable resource? Is that part of you accessible to your patients during a medical encounter? Can you think of an example? And if that part of you is not accessible to your patients, why do you think that is? So as I read it, this question gets at, are you the kind of person who others see as a source of help? And is the thing they see something your patients also see? Or is that totally different? Do I have it right?
Yeah, I think one of the sad realities of the medical training culture is that physicians deny themselves their individuality when they're with patients. We sort of start to think of ourselves as interchangeable because others see us that way. And that takes a lot of the joy and the connection out of medicine. In fact, a medical encounter is really just two human beings who are sitting down together to solve problems, to work together, in this case, on what the patient needs. But I think that a question like this tries to, in some ways, shatter that glass barrier and get us to reflect on, wait a minute, I came to medicine because of the things I value, the things I value about myself, the way I want to spend my time, the way I want to express myself. And yet somehow that gets backburnered. And so this question is designed to reconnect us to those original, maybe not universal, but common motivations for coming into medicine, and to kind of get us to think about what it is about ourselves as our friends see us and as we see ourselves that maybe we're keeping from our patients. And if so, why are we doing that?
Well, you've had the opportunity to read responses from medical residents, and I know that you will protect their confidentiality when we talk about this. But I wonder if there were some insights that some of your trainees shared with you about themselves as a person who people could turn to when they need help, and whether that's present in care or not.
I find that this is one of those questions that residents are really all over the map on. I find that there are some residents who just don't seem to want to answer it. They'll respond by just saying, I keep myself apart from who I am as a physician. I don't feel like there's any role for my patients to hear about who I am. I'm here to apply the best research evidence and so forth. And then there are others who say that, my friends love me because I'm very transparent and I'm open about myself, that I'm in therapy, that I have depression. And I bring that to my encounters with my patients. I let them know that, hey, I also get therapy. And then that often tends to open up a conversation, often a fairly, I should say, heated conversation in some case.
Yes.
About, wow, is that a good thing or is that not a good thing? And I think that when you have a safe environment and people are trusting and sort of loving of each other in a small group, it kind of causes meaningful opportunities for people to learn from each other and to grow.
I guess I have to ask, was there a right answer? I mean, I know there's no right answer. Everybody says that. But, gosh, when I help my friends, I say, look, I'm in therapy. I've struggled with very difficult feelings about myself and my family. And I don't say that to my patients, I can give you a lengthy rationale as to why I often don't, but I imagine there would be dispute over sharing such information in the clinical encounter. And what is the insight that arises from watching that dispute unfold?
So I think that there are two different threads here that often get disentangled through this conversation. One thread is that people are comfortable with people who don't put on airs and who don't try to put themselves on a higher plane. So I think that when any of us are hurting or feeling insecure, we love to talk to somebody who is also kind of an open book, who doesn't make it sound like their life is perfect and they have all their shit together. And because, then we just feel more comfortable, like we feel less insecure when we know that the person who we're talking with. And in On Becoming a Healer, I talk about how when I was in college and they had a sort of peer-to-peer counseling group, they liked to pick undergraduates who are quote unquote not pre-meds, who didn't want to like quote put this on their CV that they were a peer counselor. Instead, they were looking for people who are kind of real, right? Who are just very open. And what often comes out in these conversations is that kind of creating that sense of I share your humanity when being a doctor to a patient is often just very comforting and allows people to be open. Now, the question of when do you self-disclose very specific information about yourself, like, oh, I'm in therapy, I think that's the other thread. And I think that is a parallel conversation. And one of the things that often emerges when we talk about that is that you share information for the sole purpose of the therapeutic enterprise. In other words, if you feel that sharing information is entirely for the purpose, you have a strategic goal of helping your patient get from point A to point B, and you believe that doing so is going to be facilitated by saying something about yourself, that is a reason to do it. And that's the only reason to do it. And I think that is often where we land when we have these conversations.
That's really interesting. So, first of all, I must say that I discovered early that in relating to my peers in residency, I felt most comfortable acknowledging how shitty I felt and how difficult it was and how overwhelming it was. And I like to talk to the people who are open about that as well. But you have made this very valuable point that acts of intentional disclosure about myself to a patient have to be restricted, or we think they should be restricted in a way that is solely for the patient's benefit. And it does sound like that can come out around a table with residents and you potentially as a mentor or facilitator in that conversation.
I think a commonality of most of these questions is that they are designed to help us as physicians find increasing joy and to be increasingly nourished through our interactions with our patients, both by developing a greater sense of shared humanity while also maintaining boundary clarity.
You know, it's interesting. This may come up in a few different ways, but certainly in the process of training, I did feel that I needed to look like a doctor. I needed to sound like a doctor. And the most unnerving thing I heard was, you look too young to be a doctor. So my identity was set on, I need to look and seem like a doctor. And then I had certain models in my head of other doctors I had just watched on rounds. And then I tried to sound like them. And was there something wrong with my perception of what I was doing then? Now I think there was, but maybe there wasn't.
Well, I think that when we enter the medical profession, we feel like imposters. And so we want to model ourselves after those who don't look like they're imposters anymore, which are the older physicians. And I think that, again, a message of these questions is that the best thing you can do is tap into who you are and the joy of forming connections with people, in this case, who are ill, often, who are frightened, and who need somebody who is real, who they can be comfortable with. And that's something you can even do when you're a first-year medical student and you don't know anything about how to do a physical exam. But what you bring is caring and curiosity. And I think these questions are intended to tap into that.
Have you had a trainee who said, look, honestly, I'm not sure that who I am is a person that people would like?
That's a deeply honest statement. And I think, quite honestly, there are a number of trainees who feel that way about themselves when, in fact, they're absolutely people who patients would like. And that's very sad. And I think that that's because there's so much about our culture that makes those who make it into medicine feel deeply insecure to have a certain level of self-hate. Honestly, I think that a student or a doctor who really is, for lack of a better term, bad news or evil to patients probably wouldn't say that. They probably wouldn't, they'd probably be the last ones who would say that, unfortunately. I think the ones who say that are often the ones who have a certain level of self-hate that is very sad and unfortunate, because underneath it all, they're lovely people. And I think that these types of questions are intended to, at least in a safe environment, help people begin to get past that.
One thing I hear in what you just said, and what I know your godfather Simon said also, was you start from the supposition that the person you're in conversation with actually is good and has something to offer. And there's a certain generosity there that makes these kinds of exercise work. And if you don't have that, it's going to be a very hollow exercise.
You know, it's interesting because, as I mentioned, I've been doing these questions with residents for almost a couple of years now. And many of these are residents I supervise in the clinic, both pediatric and internal medicine residents. As you know, I'm med-peds. And what's been amazing is that these questions have been a window for me. And what I found is that I am seeing a depth in these people that I was unable to see when I was just supervising them in clinic. I'm seeing... it's wonderful. I love reading what they write. And I really mean that. And honestly, I'm not sure I expected that. I'm not sure I expected that. I'm not sure I expected how much I would find that these are people who are really grappling with some of the challenges of finding joy in medicine and have a lot to say.
Let's try another one of these questions out. I'm going to read this aloud, and I'm going to ask you to think about kinds of responses you've gotten. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to read one more. These are multi-part questions, and I'm reading all the parts. This goes as follows. Have you ever felt resentment that a patient didn't show appreciation after you significantly helped them? If so, why do you think their show of gratitude is important to you? Does the doctor-patient relationship include an expectation that patients make their doctors feel good too? Could their indifference reduce your investment in their care? What if you learned from a patient's family member that the person actually does appreciate you, but just isn't able to show it? So this one started with resentment about lack of appreciation and proceeds to kind of probe and pry that open about what do you need and what would happen if at the end, if you learned they were appreciative, but they never showed it to you. What kinds of things come up when people are writing responses to this one?
Well, first, I have to say that many years ago, Simon asked me this question. I think I was probably talking about how some patient was ungrateful and complaining about it. And Simon asked this question, and it literally blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, because I suddenly realized that, wow, I'm acting like this is all about me. When a patient comes to see me and I am reacting to the visit and to them based on whether they're feeding my ego and making me feel good, that's a huge problem. That isn't actually, and I guess I had just not really thought it through. And so I found that when I pose this question to residents, many of them have the kind of response that I had when I first had this posed to me, which is that, yeah, of course, I like my patients to show appreciation. In fact, when I ask residents, what makes you find joy in a patient interaction, often this is what they come back with. They will often say, well, I love it when, a patient shows great appreciation.
Yeah.
And yet, here's the thing. So many of our patients just are too depressed or unhappy or anxious or preoccupied with their own suffering to do that. And often those are the patients who need us most. And if they're the ones who are not showing us appreciation, the question then becomes, how does that affect the way we interact with them? Are we preferentially showing them less enthusiasm, less commitment because they're not the ones who are feeding our ego? And so this raises fundamental questions about what our role is as physicians. And one of the things I found once I started to wrestle with this is that I could actually begin to find joy when patients didn't show me appreciation, if I could see that the way in which I was interacting with them was over time making a difference. They may still be complaining, but I can see each time I'm meeting with them that things are starting to go well. And then I start to say to myself, this is awesome. This person is getting better. They may be still whining and complaining all the time, but wow, they're now exercising. They're going back to work. They're starting to laugh a little. And so once I could get past that issue, it changed the way I cared for those patients. So this is a perfect example of a question that I think can begin to open up a new window for how we approach the so-called difficult patient.
How diverse are the responses that you get from residents when they write responses to this and when they discuss it? I mean, do you have people who say, look, I'm pretty good, I'm pretty cool with people who don't show appreciation?
A minority. I would say that's maybe a quarter of them.
I think the question is valuable, but I have to say, when you talk about this, it almost sounds a little inhuman. Like, most of us are wired to react positively when somebody says thank you and to be in a different mode when they don't. Like, that's just how we are. I mean, I know you didn't write a standard of behavior in this question. It's just a question to get us thinking. But as we're talking about it, it sounds almost like Dr. Weiner would have me adopt an inhuman posture, which I sort of don't act like I'm wired to act. So,
well, I think that when patients tell us we're terrific and they love us and they're so appreciative, I think it's icing. Absolutely, it's icing, and I really like icing. Like, I love having a cake with icing. So don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with that, but think about how rewarding it is to see a patient getting better and improving as you appreciate that their continued interactions with you are causing positive change. That each time they come back, you become the sounding board as they complain about this and they complain about that, and you're the only rock in their life. Their life is chaotic. It's a mess. But they keep coming back and you can see the growth, the change. Why would you want to deny yourself the joy of appreciating that and seeing it? By the way, I'm just telling you my view, right? I think the purpose of a question like this is to put it out there and to open up a conversation like the one that you and I are having right now. And I find that if you put 3 or 4 residents together and they've written a response to this and you have different answers, then you start to have this conversation without me saying a word. And I think that's the goal.
So you have your viewpoint is very clear to me in this conversation, but if I were a resident sitting around the table, and obviously the purpose of this is an educational exercise, to what extent are the residents worried about pleasing you as the teacher who might have, I don't know, grading authority or the ability to influence their future? How do you create an emotionally safe conversation where people feel comfortable telling you they disapprove of your point of view, they really don't feel the way you wish they did? I mean, I don't know if you wish they felt a certain way, but I mean, if I were a trainee, I certainly would be making some calculations here. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. So first of all, these classes have no grade. There are absolutely no consequences, but I ask them to answer the question. And often when they send me the essay, especially early on, if they haven't answered the question, I'll send it back to them. I say, don't think you answered the question. Could you give it another shot? But that's not about the kind of stakes you're talking about. So far I've been doing this with third-year residents who are on the way out. I don't think I have power over these people. They're, unless they obviously were to rob a bank. I mean, I would probably be on some committee that would evaluate that. Although I'm actually not on any of the promotions committee for the residents at this point. I'm not listed with that group. And I think also one of the things I tell them at the very beginning is I just say, look, of course I'm your attending. You're going to be an attending in a year, but I realize I'm your attending. I invite you to call me Saul here. And one of the things I want to make very clear is that I don't care how you answer these questions. What I really care about is that you take them seriously and you engage, and I love to be challenged, and I love you to challenge each other, and that's all I ask. And again, I could be deceiving myself, but I've never really had a sense that they gave a crap about what I thought.
Excellent. That might be the first time I've ever heard somebody say, I feel good that they don't give a crap about what I think. But I think it actually applies here. So yeah. I want to try another one out with you. This is from a list that you provided me, obviously. And these are questions in your book. People who are interested in trying these out as a learning exercise with residents, we intend to put some of them up online and make them available to people at our podcast website or as part of the show notes. And here's one question, and it really gets to the heart of the issue I raised at the beginning, which is how tough it is to be a doctor sometimes, or how concerned we are about physicians' frustration. And here's how it goes. Many, if not most, work environments have a fair amount of hassle, meaning you spend a good deal of time doing nuisance work and coping with difficult colleagues and bosses. These are manageable challenges, and they even provide an opportunity to learn to negotiate and adapt. Sometimes, however, workplaces become too dysfunctional to do your job effectively or facilitate meaningful change. They are beyond repair. How would you know when that line has been crossed? Have you experienced either or both of these situations? How did you respond? What did you learn? So this gets to the survival of dysfunctional bureaucracies. Most of us who interact with electronic medical records feel like we're trying to survive that record to some degree. What kinds of responses do you get when you ask people about hassle in the medical workplace?
So this question comes at the end of a chapter that talks about how to pick a job when you finish residency, how to choose between options. And I give a number of examples from physicians who I know who have come out of residency. And one of the common scenarios is that they have two offers and one offer pays a lot more than the other. And they're like, oh, well, that's great. I'll get paid a lot more. But they haven't looked deeper at what they're going to have to do to earn that money. And they end up in a situation where they're seeing a patient every, 7 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. And they recognize at some level, there's a sort of moral injury. They recognize at some level that they're cutting a lot of corners to do the work at that speed. And that somehow doesn't rub them well. They realize at some level that it's not consistent with their values. But at the same time, they realize that if they leave, they're probably going to have to take a pay cut. And it's very hard to leave a job and take lower pay. And so, they've kind of gotten themselves into this trap. And so I think it's really important to have this conversation while you're still a resident about, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable to you in making trade-offs. And so I think that it comes out at that level of kind of hypothetical conversation. But I also find that when I ask residents to write about this, they'll often talk about their experiences on teams during residency. For instance, one resident wrote recently about when he was an intern and he had a senior resident who was just who was terrible. She was constantly making them felt demeaned, constantly putting them down, making them feel like everything was their fault. And he just talked about how demoralized and depressed. And then on top of that, the attending wasn't much help either. He was constantly pimping them, as he put it, but also not educating them. And this was on a subspecialty rotation where they desperately needed further guidance. And he said one of the things he got out of it was all the ways in which he wasn't going to be like them. And that it was just a great example of sort of reflecting on how you can learn from the bad as well as from the good, and how he was going to make sure that when it was his turn to have that level of responsibility, he was going to create a different type of environment. So I think one of the things that probably almost all physicians share in common is a general sense of distaste for the world in which we practice. We're bitter about the insurance companies. We're bitter about the electronic medical record. We're bitter about corporate medicine, and actually for good reason in many cases. But one of the things Simon used to point out to me is that, quite honestly, it's not better anywhere else. If you're not a physician, if you're a lawyer or you're an accountant or you're a teacher or whatever it is, there's a lot of hassle. And quite honestly, that's just the way it is. And I think to some degree, we maybe set unrealistic expectations as physicians that it's somehow going to be better, that we somehow should escape all that. And yet the bureaucracy that we complain about and feel so harried by is to some degree just something all our patients, or most of our patients, are experiencing too, or much worse in many cases. And as Simon put it, maybe there's something good about the fact that we share that misery with them. But there's still a reality that there are some situations where we need to draw a line. And so this question is really intended to open up a conversation, both about the reality of hassle, and that much of what we blame our burnout on is shared with many of our patients in other professions. And some of it is just toxic and calls for making a change. And we need to be cognizant about where to draw that line. So I find that a question like this gets that conversation going.
So I'm envisioning some person might respond and say, look, there's a lot of toxic stuff in medicine. The power dynamics are wrong, either in terms of how we treat others or how we're treated by the bureaucracies we work in. It's great, Saul, to reflect on my feelings about it, but my interest is in setting up a union and fighting back against the powers that be. Is that I understand, I respect that response. I'm wondering, first, do you think it's helpful to the conversation?
I love it. As you know, by the way, we did an entire episode on unionization among residents and interviewed residents who are going down that path. But the question, again, none of these questions have expected responses, or sort of, I should say, correct answers. These are questions that are designed to open up that conversation. So absolutely, if a resident responds with, hey, that's why I want to unionize, it's a fantastic opener, right? Then that conversation happens and the group goes where that's going to go. So I think yes, these questions, when questions like this lead to responses like that, they're successful.
Saul, I'm wondering if I were working in a residency program and decided that, it's going to be valuable to have this kind of exercise. First of all, it sounds like it's not necessarily easy to fit into a ward rotation month. It might be a better thing for when people are doing outpatient care and have a little bit more control over their time. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think where there's a will, there's a way. I think finding an hour every 6 weeks to have meaningful conversations about questions that challenge us is not too much to ask. I actually think the bigger challenge is facilitating them with a sense of openness and doing it in a way that makes people feel comfortable. I also think that it's really important that somebody hold the participants accountable for actually answering the questions. I would say the single biggest problem I see when I convene physicians to talk about these questions is that initially people go off on wild tangents and don't answer them, either because they're difficult to confront directly or because people just like going off on wild tangents. A lot of these questions actually ask people to give specific examples. Most of them do, actually. And I think that's critical. Otherwise, people talk in very general terms. And I've found that talking about concrete situations that we've experienced is really at the crux of making these questions productive. So I actually think the bigger issue is not just finding an hour every 6 weeks. I think it's finding a way to make sure that these conversations are substantive, that people take the questions seriously, and that they give examples from their own work and from their lives. That, to me, is the most important part of making this exercise worthwhile.
Well, as it turns out, I actually provided a working example of only partially answering the question, because I took one of your questions and attempted to craft an answer and sent it back to you before this podcast episode. I wonder if we could expose a little bit of that to show the back and forth that occurs, imagining here that I'm the trainee and the experience. Does that work for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the question was worded as follows. What parts of yourself do you show your patients, and what parts do you generally conceal? How might you behave differently when giving bad news to a friend versus a patient? That your friend or patient has a serious illness, or that a loved one has died? What are the pros and cons of any differences in how you respond to friends and patients, for your patients and for you? So I wrote the following. I'm just going to read the first paragraph because you had plenty to say on that first one. I wrote, I show my patients diligence, a desire to help, rationality. I show them an ability to identify things that might be good and bad about a given clinical decision. I conceal a good deal, although the concealing has declined since 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I did not think my own experiences or observations of, say, myself or my family had a place. Now, if the patient allows, I'm more likely to share from my own life, even if it's not based on my medical expertise. So right away, you had a few responses, particularly when I said I share with my patients diligence, a desire to help, and rationality. What was your reaction, Saul?
So as you know, I thought those were kind of generic, universal, kind of like apple pie. I mean, diligence, desire to help, rationality don't really get to your individuality, Stefan. And so I felt
Guilty.
like I felt like you were punting. I felt like that those were sort of responses that in many ways concealed rather than revealed to me what you're doing when that door is closed. And, I know you as a person, but I can't tell from your response how much of that person you're sharing and what you're concealing with your patients. So I would certainly push you to go beyond that and to be more specific.
I got a little closer, perhaps, to what you were hoping to see when I spoke about what I conceal. And I wrote, I do conceal much of my sense of humor, and I conceal the part of me that might react in a way that could affront a patient's sense of dignity. So if I smell something in a clinic visit, perhaps urine, I don't remark upon it. I usually conceal my frustration with some patients' difficult behavior, such as a refusal to engage in plans of care that the patient endorsed. So on that one, did I get it more explicit there, Saul? Or?
Well, I think that your comment that you conceal the part of yourself that might react in a way that could affront your patient's sense of dignity surprised me, because I don't know anything about you that is disrespectful towards other people. And so that was interesting to me, because I'm not sure what you're talking about. Like, what is it about you that makes you think that you have to hide something about yourself, or your patients will have their dignity compromised? You didn't say.
That's a great question. Quite honestly, this is a very naive moment. I walk into a room, I smell urine. I want to say something or ask something, or like, are your pants wet? And there's like this little sensor that says, be careful here. You may be asking somebody about incontinence in the wrong way at the wrong time.
Well, I don't think I don't see that as revealing or not revealing anything about yourself. I mean, obviously, you're revealing that you have an olfactory sense, but that's not, I think that the decision about whether to share with a patient that you smell urine is a very sensitive and important one that you would have to time very carefully if you were going to say it. But I don't see that as about revealing anything about yourself.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I don't think that. I think that's an answer to a different question.
So then we got to the issue of concealing humor. Now, of course, actually, humor does arise in my visits. I often am looking for a chance to have a laugh with patients, but I always regard humor as a little bit of a risky thing. I think about it as I worry that what could strike me as funny might, for a person in a moment of vulnerability, not strike them as funny. And I'm asking, at least scrutinizing my own potential joke, what might go wrong with this one? And that's probably what I meant. And if I were in your class, that's what I would say.
I guess my question would be, can you give an example of something that you thought was humorous when you were in the room with a patient, and then you thought twice that it might not be a good idea to share it?
Wow, that's a hard one. And I have to admit, right at the very moment, I can't think of it. So I've said it in a generic way. I mean, it wouldn't be a joke about cancer, obviously. Although, maybe there is a way that one could do that. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, when a patient makes a joke, it's often quite enjoyable, actually. There's a lot of...
So I think just to interject here, I think that follow-up questions, like the one I just asked you, are really helpful. And I find that this, and again, this gets back to specificity. So again, when I'm reading these essays and a resident says something like that, I will always follow it up with, can you give an example? And I think that is why the growth process here really depends on specificity. And abstract conversations are often not helpful. And that's what I think is key to making these questions powerful.
You've done this with over a dozen residents, or how many?
Oh, far more than that at this point. So all of the third-year residents in the pediatrics program participate, and on the medicine side, I don't know. Maybe it's been a much smaller group, because it's an elective and it's my second year. So I don't know, maybe 15 or 20.
Has anyone told you how this exercise affected them?
Yeah, I think that the feedback has been fantastic. I mean, now, of course, I should qualify that this is the first year doing it with pediatrics, so I don't have feedback yet from the residents in terms of a formal evaluation. But on the medicine side, one of the highest compliments I got is that one of the members of the of PGY3 group that participated told me that when he goes off to his academic medicine job, he'd like to set up a program like this at his own institution, at the place he's going, and facilitate a group himself. Another thing I found is that residents have found that this has been somewhat of an antidote to burnout, that this is an opportunity for them to speak openly about a lot of the grief and to some degree PTSD that they experienced during the pandemic. Last year, I had a lot of third-year residents who were devastated by what they had been through here in Chicago, caring for patients dying of COVID. And they felt like they hadn't really had a place to start to reflect on what that was all about. And what's interesting about these questions is these questions are not softball questions. They're actually quite challenging. And that's a little bit counterintuitive that these questions are often a way to find some relief rather than to feel like you're being pushed when you're already exhausted. So I think that these questions are actually well-timed when you're working with a group of residents who are at rock bottom, actually. Now, I haven't had a chance to do this with younger residents or medical students. I think that would be interesting as well. My experience has been mostly with residents who are at the end of their training experience. And it's, I found based on the feedback I've gotten, which by the way is completely anonymous. We do this with Qualtrics. So when they send in their responses, we have no idea who they are. And of course they know that. And I think that the growth part of this has been the most important piece that I've gotten from feedback, that it's given them an opportunity to reflect on what they've been through in a way that they just haven't gotten a chance to do. And it's left me almost sad that residents who don't participate in this don't get that opportunity to grow and reflect at this critical phase in their life.
One of the things that comes up, though, is that you've got a class, so to speak. I was trying to, as you're talking about this, I was thinking about, well, could I propose that my residents and interns or the team that I work with on wards set aside usually 20 minutes. They can't really set aside more than that after walk rounds because, the day is demanding on the inpatient side. I'm pretty sure that it would be awkward on an inpatient ward rotation. But if I were to raise it and ask, would it work as a one-time exercise with medical students, interns, and residents in the room? Or would that just completely misfit the situation where people are at different levels of training, different levels of perceived power, and maybe have some competing demands? Would it just all misfire?
I think that the ground rules have to be safety. I think that mixing and matching medical students and residents and attendings, having them in the same room, all of that could be wonderful, could be fascinating, but only under conditions where people have no reason to think they can't be open. So if there's any sense that, I'm going to be graded by this person, or this person has power over me, or I'm going to need that's going to kill it. I think it has to be a setting where people have absolute confidence that they are safe. And that's really the condition for this exercise to be meaningful and productive. Otherwise, it could be exactly the opposite. But I think if those conditions are met, then anything is fair game.
So now to think about doctors who are already in practice, maybe busy, maybe overloaded, residency program director, somebody who's got a busy life and thinking, frankly, I would love to talk about some essential questions about what it means for me to be a doctor, but I'm now living a hectic life. I don't have a residency program that I'm a resident in. I'm actually potentially in practice or helping train others. Where would we seek those conversations, or where would we be able to engage in these questions in a structured way? What could we do?
So one thing that you are aware of is that my team has audio recorded many doctor-patient encounters with attendings using our research methods where the audio recorder is concealed with the physician's permission. And often what we hear is quite sad. We hear a physician who is kind of clicking away at a computer and asking just rote questions of a patient. When was your last colonoscopy? Have you had a mammogram? Do you need a flu shot? And there's just a lack of engagement and connection. And it's very easy to see why physicians would just burn out from that. And often there is every reason to believe that this patient has a lot more going on and needs to talk to somebody. And so there's such a missed opportunity. And I feel like that's all about our culture that turns us into these efficient task completers. And these questions are intended to kind of break through that and to get a conversation happening. And one of the things that has come out is that physicians in practice are often lonely. They feel isolated from their peers. They feel like they're locked in a box and that they don't have connection. And many years ago, there was something called Balint groups where physicians got together and talked about patient care, talked about the relationships with patients, and did it in a way that was facilitated. And this is, in many ways, a return to that. It's an opportunity for physicians who are colleagues in a practice, to go out for a beer or whatever, and have substantive conversations about what it is to be a physician, using these questions that are intended to challenge them and ultimately to hopefully deepen their capacity to have nourishing and joyous relationships with their patients.
So for people who are interested in using these questions as a tool for reflection, I want to underscore again that all of them are covered in the book, a brief book written by you, Saul, and I'm putting in a direct plug on Becoming a Healer, which just surprisingly happens to be the name of this podcast. So that's one way to get them. It is also our intention to provide those questions as part of the show notes for this show so that people, at least some of them, so that people can try them out, potentially as a written exercise where they meet afterwards and discuss what happens. And if anybody does give them a shot, we'd love to hear from you and report back. And we're interested in what happens. Saul, any final thoughts on the use of questions to tear the curtain away on who we are and what we're trying to be and how we are experiencing the practice of medicine?
Well, Stefan, I really appreciate, your delving into this and actually being fair game to do one of them. And that was fun. And I hope that these are helpful to people. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Saul.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have, and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Take care, everyone.